Hey everybody, Forrest here with Rocky Mountain School of Photography, and today we're going to look at my best photo settings for the GoPro Hero 11 Black. Let's go ahead and dive in. I do have a few quick disclaimers to get out of the way first. Number one is this is not going to be a quick tips video. My goal in this video is to show you how to get the best image quality out of the GoPro and use the sensor in this camera to its fullest potential. Second disclaimer is that I have a full guide on the best video settings that you can find down in the description. And finally, thirdly, please ignore my camera friend here over my shoulder as it is providing the over-the-shoulder view of the screen on the GoPro itself. I'm going to be doing these settings on the back screen of the camera. Do be aware though that the GoPro app does give you all of these controls as well if you'd rather use your phone for those settings instead of the back of the camera. So the first thing that we're gonna go ahead and do is put our camera into photo mode. And the way we can do that is just swipe left or right until we get to the photo, the little picture of the camera. That means we're in the right mode of operation. Now there are some general preferences I'd like to go over first before we get into the actual camera settings. In order to get to those, what we're gonna do is swipe down from the top. This gives us some of the quick access buttons. I covered these in depth in the video settings tutorial, so be sure to check that out down in the description if you wanna learn more about these. But the thing I wanna highlight is if I swipe right and I go to preferences here, I wanna talk a little bit about formatting your camera memory card. So, as you may or may not know, inside of your GoPro is a micro SD card. That is the card that holds your pictures and video when you shoot them to the camera. The problem with those memory cards is they go corrupted sometimes. They just get bad. And I get tons of YouTube comments and student questions of people who get corrupted photos and video and want to recover them. Well, this video is not about recovery, but it is about how to prevent those issues. And one of the best ways to do that is by routinely formatting your memory card. Now, very big important disclaimer, formatting your card erases all data on the card. So only perform a format once your images, photos, videos, whatever are backed up to your computer or your phone or wherever you've been storing them. To format the card, I'm gonna go ahead and scroll down here in the preferences. I'm gonna go to reset and I'm gonna choose format SD card. It does give you a warning here that it's going to delete all files. I'm gonna go ahead and hit format. Now for me, I do this on a regular basis. Whenever I put a new memory card into my GoPro that I've downloaded the pictures off of, I'm gonna go ahead and run a format. You also never wanna change a memory card between multiple devices without formatting on that device. So I have a drone that also uses micro SD cards. If I was going to share cards between them, I would be sure to download my pictures between sharing the card, and then I would also be sure that I format that card in that specific device. Even between different GoPro Hero 11 Blacks, you can still run into issues. So formatting is a great thing to add to your workflow. Additionally, there are some other tweaks inside of these preferences. I've covered them more in depth in the video tutorial, so check that out again down in the description. One other thing that I need to highlight in the preferences is ensuring that our controls are on the Pro mode. Especially when we get into our photo settings, I really recommend giving you all of the controls that you need, and this unlocks all the buttons, all the features, so to speak. So once we're on Pro mode, I'm gonna go ahead and swipe up, and then what I'm gonna do is tap this button down here at the bottom, which gets us into our actual camera settings. Now from here, I'm gonna go to the photo mode and I'm gonna hit the little pencil to edit my photo settings. Now you might think that we would start with lens because that's in the upper left-hand corner where we would normally start, but instead I'm gonna go to output and look at my different output options. These are kind of the modes of operation of our GoPro camera. And you'll notice we have SuperPhoto, we have HDR, we have standard, and we have RAW. Now, immediately here, we need to make a big decision. If you are an enthusiast or professional photographer who is using the GoPro in addition to their other cameras, I would highly recommend shooting RAW. RAW is going to give you all of the editability, resolution, quality that the GoPro camera is capable of producing. The downside is though, out of the camera, a RAW photo will not look as good as one of these other options. So think of the RAW as being like the pure unedited photo. It has the most information, but it needs editing software to have its full potential brought out. And that editing software could be something like Lightroom or the GoPro Quick app or the Photos app on your phone, whatever you want to use, but just think RAW needs editing. On the other hand, if you want to be a photographer who just shoots photos, takes them off the GoPro, very few little tweak edits, and they send those photos out to somebody, this is where I would recommend the SuperPhoto option. SuperPhoto is the basically full auto. Think of it that way. The GoPro is going to make as many decisions for you as it can, and it's going to help you create the best possible image. Now, I will point out that the other options like HDR and standard are kind of like halfway points. Standard is going to be a standard JPEG photo, JPEG being like a RAW, but slightly edited. Think of it as having a little bit more contrast, a little bit more saturation. And then HDR is going to be even a step further as far as the automatic image processing is concerned, with again the SuperPhoto, that top option, being the best, most auto, best out of camera experience. So again, I would say RAW for someone who is familiar with a RAW workflow, SuperPhoto if this is a little bit more new to you. I'm gonna go ahead and choose RAW because for me, I would rather have more data out of the camera and have a little bit more options when it comes to post-production. All right, now this does lock out some options. I wanna point out that when we choose RAW, all of a sudden lens is grayed out as well as zoom. And that's because RAW is RAW. It's always gonna be the widest lens with no zoom. It's gonna be the pure sensor information, the best quality. And that's because the GoPro doesn't actually have a zoom lens. If I put this thing onto SuperPhoto, and we go to our lens options, you can see that we actually have a wide lens or a linear lens. Well, it's not actually changing the lens of the camera, it's just applying software processing to correct for the fisheye effect the GoPro naturally has. So in RAW, you're always gonna have that fisheye effect because that's the raw data from the sensor. SuperPhoto is gonna give us an option. And even if we went into standard, that's gonna give us the same two lens options that the SuperPhoto does. So takeaway here is if you want to have a unfisheyed photo without any editing, that SuperPhoto or standard, basically a non-RAW mode, is gonna be able to do that for you. Now I also want to point out that zoom is not really zoom. You can see as I drag this slider, it zooms things in. All that's doing is essentially cropping. So again, if you shoot RAW, you fix the fisheye effect in post-production and you crop in post-production, you're basically doing the same thing as the GoPro zoom function and the GoPro lens function. Long story short, RAW folks, you're not missing out on anything. You're just adding extra steps for yourself to get those extra editability options. I will point out scheduled capture and timer are pretty cool as well. Scheduled capture is just a very simple way to tell your GoPro to turn on at a certain future date and time to start taking photos. And then timer is gonna be a self-timer. So if you were gonna take a group photo of you and some friends, you could set your GoPro up on a tripod, turn on the 2-second or 3-second or 10-second timer, and you'd be able to run into the photo and take a photograph. So again, here recommendation is if you're gonna use SuperPhoto, I would definitely take the time to decide, do you want that linear field of view like a normal wide angle shot, or do you want that fisheye look with the wide lens? And then also understand that zoom is simply cropping. You can totally do that in post-production. And so I would say, regardless of what setting you have your camera set to, I would leave it on a 1x zoom setting. And then I would do my crop in post. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and put mine back on RAW now that we understand those different options and settings that we have, and I'm gonna scroll down to the ProTune settings. Now these ProTune settings are really where things start to come alive. And I should start by saying that it's very important to understand how f-stop, shutter speeds, and ISOs work in order to fully grasp these ProTune settings. We actually have a whole suite of videos on the basics of exposure. We also have an online class, so I will leave those links down below if that interests you. But for those people who have a little bit of experience in it, essentially what the GoPro is giving us here is a shutter speed selection. So we can run from 1/125th all the way to 1/2000th of a second. Moral of the story here is as our shutter speed gets faster, so as we bring this up, we are gonna have more ability to stop motion in our photographs, but our images are also going to get darker. So you're gonna lose light because your shutter is open for less time. Generally, I'm gonna leave this on auto and I'm gonna let the camera make the best decision for me. EV comp, you can think of this as exposure compensation. Essentially, if you're looking at the screen on the back of your camera and say you're shooting maybe a backlit subject, say a person standing in front of a bright window, sometimes the camera can get confused by all that bright light behind the person. And what you can do is turn on a plus EV compensation, which will basically tell the camera to shoot the image brighter than what it thinks is proper. Think of that as an override, a make it brighter or make it darker override based on what you're seeing on the screen on the back of the camera. White balance is key. White balance is one of those things, it controls the color of light in your photographs. Essentially, all light sources have a color temperature or a color to them. As an example, the light that's shining on my face right now is a very white, pure light. Fluorescent lights that you'd find in like a hotel or a hospital, something like that, those are very green. Tungsten incandescent screw-in light bulbs, like before LEDs were a thing, but old-fashioned screw-in light bulbs, Edison bulbs, those are very warm, they're very orange toned. And our camera needs to compensate for those white balance colors that are out there in the world. Now I'm gonna make this very simple for you. If you are on SuperPhoto mode, or standard mode, or HDR mode, basically not RAW. If you're shooting one of the non-RAW modes, I would take a second to accurately set your white balance. Drag that slider up and down until the colors on the back of the camera look accurate to what you're seeing in the scene. If you're shooting RAW, on the other hand, I would always leave this on native or auto because RAW gives us the ability to edit our white balance after we take the photographs. And that's one of those big perks of RAW is you don't have to sweat the white balance when you're shooting, you do it in the editing process after. So for me, since I have my camera on RAW right now, I would set my white balance to native, which is roundabout daylight balanced for those of you who are familiar with what white balance is. All right, next we get to ISO min and ISO max. This is locking the camera at what minimum and maximum ISO you want the camera to use. Now, it's basically gonna pick whatever ISO is suitable somewhere in that range between the min and the max that you specify. If you want the camera to always use the lowest ISO, meaning having the best quality, less amount of noise, all of that stuff that comes along with that, what you can actually do is set your ISO max down to 100. And if you set your min to 100 and your max to 100, it will always use an ISO of 100. Do be aware though, if you are a beginner and you're not familiar with this can very easily lead to you shooting photographs that are too dark, that are underexposed. So if you're an advanced user, setting my ISO min and max to a specific ISO that I'm looking to use can be a great way to do it. If you're a beginner user, I would leave that range wide open from 100 at min to 3200 at max. That brings me to sharpness and color. So sharpness is simply how much fake sharpening you want the camera to apply to your images. Now, right now I am on RAW mode, which means technically that sharpness is not actually going to be applied to the photos themselves. So I don't have to worry about this as much with RAW. But if I was shooting standard or HDR or SuperPhoto or one of those other modes, I would probably lower this down to low. I want the camera to do as little to my photos as possible so that it gives me more headroom to do those adjustments in post-production. Color as well, there's kind of three options here. We have flat, which think of that as muted, not much color, not much contrast, not much saturation. We have standard, or natural, which is trying to be a natural rendition of what the world actually looks like. And then we have vibrant, which is just adding saturation and adding contrast. Again, if I'm shooting RAW, this isn't gonna have a huge effect on my final photos, but if I'm shooting one of the non-RAW modes, I'm probably gonna leave this on natural or even flat. Again, all of these things can be added in post-production, but it's much harder to remove them. So think as we want the camera to do as little as possible, and then post, we can layer those things on top of one another to give us the final image that we're after. All right, the final section down here is our shortcuts. So this is simply what the 4 buttons, if I go back here, on the left and right of the screen are, what they're all for. So I wouldn't touch these yet. In fact, I might even go into my settings again and edit and come down here, and I might set my shortcuts here to off and just not have them and just use the camera. And pay attention to what you're changing on a regular basis and start to create those shortcuts based on those things. So I'm gonna go ahead and turn these all off here. There we go. So this way I can kind of say, all right, well, I have a blank slate now. And as I start to realize, oh, I'm adjusting my ISO min and my ISO max all the time, I'm gonna go ahead and set up a shortcut for those specific things. Let's go ahead and do a quick review. If you want to use RAW mode, you want to give your camera the most editability possible when you get into post-production. What you're also going to do that I recommend is set your white balance to native, because you can change it after the fact, set your sharpness to low, and your color to flat. If, on the other hand, we are going to use, say, SuperPhoto mode, where it makes a lot of the decisions for us, in that instance, I'm gonna set my white balance to the scene, whatever the scene happens to be, and how we figure that out is just by dragging up and down in order to get the settings set right until things look nice. And then you'll notice it actually sets the other stuff for me, with the exception of sharpness, which again, I would leave on low, trying to make the camera do as little as possible so we can apply those changes in post-production. I will say, highly recommend that if you are a beginning photographer starting to get into photography and you want to really get the most out of this camera, shooting on RAW and really starting to dive into what aperture and shutter speed and ISO do for you. Now, I say aperture or f-stop, the GoPro does not actually have a variable aperture lens. So you will see a lot of things about aperture or f-stops when you're learning about exposure. Just know that the GoPro itself is locked to an aperture all the time. We don't have that ability to change it, which kind of makes it nice for learning, because all you have to worry about is your ISO and your shutter speed, and you can play and see what you can create with this camera. All right, everybody, I hope you found that useful. That was my overview of the best photo settings on the GoPro Hero 11 Black. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments section down below. And lastly, don't forget to check out those other videos I put in the description and our online class. If you really want to get good at exposure and understanding how all of this works, we have a great online class that you guys can check out to get into this and learn more. Thanks, everybody. I'll catch you in the next one.